Prepare to delve into the depths of antiquity, where myths intertwine with possible reality. A leisurely, almost meditative journey awaits us, taking us into the heart of a lost world, the legendary Atlantis. Dim the lights, wrap yourself in a soft blanket, let the day's hustle recede, and let silence be your sole companion. We are about to explore a city whose outlines may have graced the earth millennia ago. A city where people walked its streets, their faces forever veiled by the mists of time, where they watched sunsets over harbours now silently resting beneath boundless ocean waves. Today, the gates will open before you to markets overflowing with spices brought from the farthest corners of the world. You will hear the gentle murmur of fountains in courtyards where, long ago, wise men engaged in endless debates about the very nature of truth. So dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan, letting its soft hum become an unobtrusive background. And now, let us begin our journey to a place that exists somewhere on the fine line between history and dream, between fleeting memory and boundless imagination. Imagine yourself walking down a street that no longer exists, in a city that might have been real, where the morning light falls differently than anywhere you've ever been. The cobblestones beneath your feet are smooth and warm, polished by countless steps over hundreds of years. Everywhere there is the soft sound of water, fountains, canals, the distant rhythm of waves against the harbour walls. This is Atlantis before its tragic fall, and you feel what an ordinary Tuesday might have been like in the most extraordinary city the world has ever known. But here's the striking thing about extraordinary places. Most of the time, the people who live there are engaged in perfectly ordinary activities. They are buying bread, fixing broken cartwheels, exchanging opinions about the weather, and wondering what to make for dinner. The bakery you pass emanates the aromas of honey and freshly baked grain. The baker himself is likely the third generation of his family to continue their trade in this very corner. His hands are covered in flour, his face focused on the simple yet vital task of feeding his neighbours. The bread here is different from what you know. It's darker, denser, mixed with seeds that give it a unique, nutty flavour. The baker shapes each loaf by hand, just as his grandfather taught him, and as his grandfather's grandfather learned centuries ago, preserving age-old traditions. You notice how the buildings around you rise in graceful curves, their walls made of pale stone that seems to glow softly in the morning light. The architecture here follows principles that appear simultaneously ancient and incredibly advanced. Each building seems to grow naturally from the earth, as if the city itself is alive, breathing in rhythm with the tides. A woman passes by, carrying a basket of vegetables from the market. Her tunic is simple but artfully woven, dyed in colours that somehow capture the exact shade of sea foam. She nods politely as she passes, as is customary in small communities where everyone knows everyone, even in a city that stretches beyond the horizon. The market square ahead hums with a gentle energy of commerce. Merchants have arrived from distant lands. Their ships are moored in harbours capable of accommodating vessels from all corners of the known world. Dozens of languages mingle in the air. Traders from Egypt discuss the quality of gold. Sailors from northern islands compare the merits of different types of amber. What strikes you most is how peaceful everything seems. There are no guards marching through the streets. There are no signs of conflict or tension. The people of Atlantis have created something remarkable, a society where trade flows freely, where different cultures meet and mingle without friction, where the chief concerns are artistic, philosophical, and practical matters rather than military ones. You stop by a fountain in the center of the square. Water flows from a carved stone figure. It is not a god or goddess, but simply an image of the ocean itself, stylized waves that seem to move, though made of solid stone. The water is clean and cool, delivered by an engineering system that would rival anything the Romans would build centuries later. Children play nearby, their games involving intricate patterns drawn in the sand, mathematical puzzles that would challenge adults in other civilizations. Education here begins early and continues throughout life. The Atlanteans have discovered that a society becomes stronger when every member can think clearly, solve problems creatively, and understand the world around them. An old man sits on a bench, carving figures from driftwood. His hands move slowly but surely, and you realize he is not making toys or ornaments. He is creating teaching aids, small sculptures that help children understand geometry, astronomy, and natural sciences. In Atlantis, even leisure serves a purpose, though that purpose is always gentle, always aimed at growth rather than control. The afternoon brings different rhythms. Workshops open their doors to release heat from forges and kilns. Artisans work with metals and ceramics, creating both practical items and objects of pure beauty. There is no rush, no sense that everything must be finished immediately. Quality takes time, and Atlantis has time in abundance. You watch a potter shape clay on her wheel. Her movements are hypnotic and assured. The vessel emerging beneath her hands will eventually hold olive oil or wine, but she treats it as if she is creating a work of art. For in Atlantis, there is no real distinction between the useful and the beautiful. Everything is crafted to serve both functions. As evening approaches, you notice how the city transforms. Lamps begin to glow in windows, but these are not the smoky, flickering torches you might expect. The Atlanteans have developed an oil-burning system that produces a clean, steady light. The streets remain safely illuminated without being harsh or intrusive. Families gather for dinner on rooftop terraces overlooking the harbour. The food is simple but varied. Fresh fish, vegetables grown in gardens using sophisticated irrigation systems, fruits carefully cultivated to thrive in this particular climate. Meals are long social affairs where conversation is as important as the food. Music can be heard, emanating from different districts. These are not so much performances as the natural outcome of people being trained to appreciate rhythm, melody, and harmony. A young man tunes a stringed instrument while his sister practices scales on a wind instrument that produces sounds like a gentle sea breeze. The harbour never fully sleeps. Ships arrive with the evening tide, bringing goods, news, and travellers from across the known world. The mooring process is smooth and efficient, managed by harbour masters who have turned the loading and unloading of vessels into something akin to a dance. Night in Atlantis feels different from night anywhere else. The city doesn't close down, it transforms. The daytime energy of commerce and industry gives way to contemplation, study, and quiet celebration. Libraries remain open, their reading rooms filled with scholars exploring questions that fascinate them. Observatories track the movements of stars and planets, adding to knowledge that will influence navigation, agriculture, and timekeeping. Walking through the residential areas, you see families engaged in activities that seem both familiar and strange. Parents help children with studies that include mathematics, natural philosophy, and what we might call sociology. But they also make time for music, physical training, and practical skills like cooking and basic engineering. The rich and poor in Atlantis lived differently, but not as starkly differently as in other civilizations. Prosperity here seems to be more evenly distributed, perhaps because the Atlanteans understood something about economics that later societies would forget. A community becomes stronger when everyone has enough, when no one despairs, when talents can flourish regardless of birth circumstances. Before you fall asleep tonight, you might wonder about the details that made this daily life possible. How did they organize their government? What did they do about crime, conflict, the inevitable disagreements that arise when people live together? How did they manage to create abundance without destroying the environment that sustained them? These are questions that philosophers and historians have debated for thousands of years. But lying here in the quiet darkness, perhaps the most important question is simpler. What would it have been like to live in a place where ordinary life itself was a kind of art, where the daily routines of existence were honed by generations into something approaching perfection? And perhaps, as you drift to sleep, you might wonder what broke this delicate balance. What forces could have been powerful enough to bring an end to a civilization that seemed to have solved so many problems that still challenge us today? In that peaceful city where you walked yesterday, where bakers kneaded bread and children played mathematical games in the square, something was beginning that no one yet understood. The signs were subtle at first, the kind you might notice but dismiss, like a slight shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The silence of the great submergence, a chronicle of Atlantis. Morning arrived, like so many others, ordinary and habitual. The harbour master, following a centuries-old routine, made his rounds. His gaze swept over the tide charts, whose accuracy had been unquestionable for generations. Yet today the water level seemed slightly higher than usual. The difference was minor, not indicative of disaster, but enough to make him pause and meticulously recheck his measurements. In the fertile agricultural land stretching beyond the city centre, farmers anxiously discovered that some of their irrigation canals had begun to clog. The intricate and carefully constructed system of waterways which had served them faithfully for centuries showed inexplicable malfunctions. Wells that had always yielded crystal clear and cool water now ran murky. Springs emerging from deep within the earth expelled water with an altered taste, saltier, with an unusual mineral tang never before detected. It was the scholars, immersed in their vast libraries, who first began to grasp the connection between these seemingly disparate and minor phenomena. Atlantis had always been a civilization deeply attentive to patterns, constantly striving to discover links between events that at first glance seemed utterly unrelated. They possessed sophisticated instruments for precisely measuring water levels, devices for detecting the slightest changes in the geological stability of the Earth's crust, and developed methods for tracking the behavior of underground springs and aquifers. One can imagine one of these researchers in a quiet library reading room surrounded by countless scrolls and clay tablets containing centuries of meticulous observations. An elderly keeper of knowledge bending over maps showing tidal patterns for 2 centuries carefully smooths them out. Her finger slowly traces lines that bear witness to subtle but steady changes that have accumulated over decades. The reality of what happened to Atlantis turned out to be both more complex and far simpler than the dramatic legends that would be passed down by subsequent civilizations. There was no single catastrophic day when the earth suddenly opened up and swallowed the majestic city. Instead, a slow, gradual process unfolded, one that might have lasted months or even years. The island on which Atlantis was built had always been geologically active. The same powerful subterranean forces that carved its natural harbours, provided the hot springs that heated its buildings, and created the rich mineral deposits that fueled its metallurgy, were also gradually eroding and shifting the foundations of their world. Imagine walking through the city during that period. As people began to grasp the magnitude of what was happening, the atmosphere was not one of panic. Rather, it was filled with a spirit of meticulous preparation. The Atlanteans were a pragmatic people, and they began to make deliberate, practical decisions about how to respond to a situation that, while beyond their control to stop, was not beyond their capacity to manage. Ships in the harbour began to be loaded differently. Instead of usual trade goods, they took on passengers, invaluable documents and items necessary for establishing new settlements in other regions. The loading process was methodical, almost routine, as if the Atlanteans had foreseen such a possibility and knew precisely what they needed to do. Families gathered together to make difficult decisions about what to take and what, alas, to leave behind. One can imagine these conversations, practical, emotional, but devoid of despair. These people deeply understood that civilizations rise and then fall, that truly valuable things, knowledge, relationships, fundamental values, could be transported, unlike buildings and monuments. Artisans and craftsmen worked with a new, palpable urgency, yet not to save their workshops. Instead, they focused on transmitting their skills to the younger generation, who would carry these abilities to new homes. The potter you watched working the day before now dedicated her time to teaching apprentices not only how to shape clay, but how to identify good clay deposits, how to build kilns, and how to create glazes from available materials. The water level continued to rise steadily, but so gradually that each successive day felt almost normal. The ground floors of buildings first became damp, then flooded, but people simply moved to upper floors and continued their daily lives. Markets were relocated to higher ground. The harbour had to be continually dredged to maintain its functionality, yet ships continued to arrive and depart without interruption. What was truly remarkable during this period was how the social structure of Atlantis maintained its integrity, even as its physical foundation crumbled. There was no breakdown of law and order, no hoarding of resources, no abandonment of the old or infirm. On the contrary, the community became even more cohesive as people realized they would have to rely on each other in new ways. Children continued to attend schools, but their lessons now included new, vital skills: navigation, boat handling, identification of plants and animals that could provide food and medicine in unfamiliar environments. The education system adapted to prepare the next generation for a life that would be drastically different from what their parents had known. The religious and philosophical leaders of Atlantis dedicated their time to helping people make sense of what was happening in emotionally and spiritually meaningful terms. They spoke of cycles of growth and change, of the impermanence of all material things, and of how endings could also be new beginnings. As the weeks turned into months, the evacuation became increasingly systematic and orderly. Groups of families boarded ships bound for various destinations, some to existing colonies, others to unexplored lands where they would have to start anew. Each departure was treated as a celebration rather than merely a farewell, accompanied by ceremonies that honored both what was left behind and what could be created in new places. The final phase was surprisingly calm and peaceful. The last inhabitants of Atlantis were mainly elderly people who had volunteered to stay to maintain vital services until the very end, along with a group of scholars and priests whose task was to preserve and protect crucial knowledge and cultural treasures. One can imagine them working by the flickering light of lamps in buildings where the ground floors were already completely submerged, carefully wrapping scrolls and tablets, selecting the most valuable items to be loaded onto the last ships. Their work was methodical, almost meditative, as if they were performing a sacred duty that was more important than their own survival. The inundation itself, when it finally occurred, was less a catastrophe than a gradual descent into a state of slumber. Buildings did not dramatically and noisily collapse. They simply sank slowly beneath the waves, which rose steadily, relentlessly, but without violence. Atlanteans who witnessed the end later described it as a strangely beautiful sight, akin to their city transforming into something new, rather than simply being destroyed. The waters that engulfed Atlantis were warm and clear. Fish swam freely through the windows of buildings where families had lived for generations. Gardens transformed into underwater forests where marine plants now grew among the carefully tended roses and fruit trees that had once nourished the populace. The last ship to leave the island carried with it the final group of evacuees, along with the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved much that was remarkable, and then accepted its inevitable end with dignity and grace. As they sailed away, the passengers could see the tops of the highest towers still rising above the water, like islands in an archipelago, marking the boundaries of what had once been the greatest city in the world. As you drift to sleep tonight, perhaps you might reflect on those last ships and their passengers, sailing towards unknown shores with all they could salvage from their lost homeland. What did they carry with them, beyond their material possession? What stories did they tell their children about a place they could never return to? And perhaps in your dreams, images of those submerged ruins will emerge, where fish now swim through the same courtyards where you imagined yourself walking, where fountains, once spouting fresh water, now blend seamlessly with the endless currents of the sea. Centuries after the last ship sailed from the sinking spires of Atlantis, an old Greek man sat in a shaded Athenian courtyard, trying to recall the precise words of a story that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. His name was Solon, and he was renowned as one of Greece's wisest men, a celebrated lawgiver and philosopher who had travelled widely and learned much. However, this particular story was not a product of his own wanderings among the Greek islands or negotiations with foreign kings. This story had been recounted to him by Egyptian priests, keepers of knowledge who were ancient even when Greek civilization was still nascent, just finding its way in the world. Imagine Solon as a much younger man, perhaps in his 60s, which by the standards of the time was considered quite advanced in years, walking through the temple complex in Sais, Egypt. The morning is warm but not yet hot, and the shadows from the enormous columns offer welcome coolness from the scorching sun. He is here as both a tourist and an inquisitive student, drawn by reports that Egyptian priests possess historical records spanning thousands of years. The priest who greets him is even older than Solon himself, his face etched with the deep lines of decades of study and contemplation. His name, if Solon ever knew it, has been lost to the depths of history, but his role was undeniable. He was a keeper of memories, a guardian of stories that might otherwise have been forever forgotten. Their path led unhurriedly through galleries whose walls were covered with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions. These ancient symbols recounted the deeds of mighty pharaohs, the life-giving floods of the Nile, periods of bloody wars and eras of prosperous peace, revealing a chronicle of the rise and fall of great civilizations that had long passed their zenith, when Hellas was merely a collection of scattered, sparse tribes, dispersed across rocky islands and rugged, mountainous peninsulas. The priest spoke slowly and deliberately, as if each utterance carried a specific weight, demanding meticulous precision in its delivery. In conversation with Solon, he remarked that the Hellenes, in the context of comprehending the deep history of the cosmos, resembled unlearned children, and the reason for this was not a lack of intellect or insight, but an inability to transmit and safeguard accumulated knowledge across a succession of centuries. "You Hellenes," the priest declared, settling onto a cool stone bench in a sun-drenched courtyard, where palm fronds cast intricate dancing shadows, "you are always beginning your journey anew. Whether a great flood occurs, a powerful earthquake shakes the earth, or a bloody war erupts, your repositories of wisdom inevitably turn to ashes. Your great thinkers pass away, and with them their invaluable knowledge irrevocably vanishes. You consign your own past to oblivion, believing that the history of the world begins only with your personal memories and current events." Solon listened with the imperturbable composure of a sage who has grasped a truth. The most profound and significant lessons of life are often revealed slowly, step by step, rather than in sudden dramatic revelations. He inquired about the Egyptian annals, wishing to learn how their civilization managed to safeguard its knowledge through successive generations, surviving the rise and fall of numerous dynasties. The priest gestured to the surrounding walls, covered with carved symbols that represented not merely individual words, but entire concepts and complex philosophical ideas, eternally etched in stone, capable of withstanding the test of millennia. "What others inscribe on fragile papyrus, we carve into durable stone," he explained. "Furthermore, we train many priests to remember the same traditions, and we build our repositories of knowledge deep underground, where destructive floods cannot penetrate and where all-consuming fire cannot engulf them." And then, almost casually, as if speaking of insignificant events of the past week, the priest began to narrate to Solon the legendary tale of Atlantis. He presented it not as a vague myth or a fairy tale legend, but as a perfectly real historical event, one that occurred just as wars erupt, famines strike, or new cities are founded. According to the priest's account, the Chronicle of Atlantis was preserved in Egyptian archives because Egypt was one of the few civilizations that maintained continuous ties with this powerful island kingdom. Egyptian ships regularly undertook trading voyages to the shores of Atlantis, exchanging goods with its merchants. Egyptian sages meticulously studied Atlantean achievements in mathematics and engineering, and when Atlantis began to sink into the sea, some of its inhabitants, fleeing, reached Egyptian lands, bringing with them valuable eyewitness accounts of that terrible catastrophe. Solon posed his questions with the appropriate circumspection of a true historical investigator. He was interested in the specific dates of events, the precise geographical location of the island, and the peculiarities of Atlantean political organization. The priest responded as thoroughly and accurately as the available information allowed, though he acknowledged that some fragments of this ancient history had been lost even from the Egyptian annals. Their conversation lasted not just a day, but perhaps several weeks. With each sunrise, Solon returned to the temple, and each morning the priest unveiled new, previously unknown details about the long-vanished civilization. The subject of their deep discussions was not only the tragic end of Atlantis, but also the structure of its society, its highly developed agriculture, its exquisite forms of art, and a political system that seemed to strike a harmonious balance between individual freedoms and collective responsibility. One can easily imagine Solon returning to his dwelling each evening, diligently making notes, striving to record everything he remembered, aiming to convey not only the dry facts, but also the very atmosphere, the spirit of this great story. His goal was to preserve that astonishing sense of wonder and profound loss that the priest conveyed, speaking of a civilization that had reached unprecedented heights and then so utterly vanished. Finally, Solon's stay in Egypt came to an end, and he journeyed back to Athens, carrying with him this truly extraordinary story. However, it is from this point that the narrative takes on more human, more complex shades. Solon was already an old man burdened with numerous responsibilities. His time was consumed by state affairs, law-making, and the countless concerns of daily life in a Greek city-state. Thus, the story of Atlantis, for all its astonishing nature, gradually became just one of many memories of his extensive travels. Solon began to write down the history of Atlantis, intending to create a full historical narrative, perhaps even an epic poem, to preserve this tradition for future generations. However, the work progressed extremely slowly. The urgent demands of daily life constantly distracted him, and so this grand project remained unfinished when Solon passed from this world. The unfinished manuscript was inherited first by Solon's family members, then by his closest friends, and later by their descendants and acquaintances. For several generations it remained one of those artifacts carefully preserved in the libraries of intellectual families, recognized as interesting and potentially significant, but never urgent enough to complete. It awaited its moment until it came into the hands of a young man named Plato, who was Solon's great-great-nephew, or perhaps even great-great-great-nephew. The exact degree of their kinship, unfortunately, has been lost to the depths of time. However, their intellectual succession was undeniable. By then, Plato was already gaining renown as an outstanding philosopher, a devoted student of Socrates, a thinker deeply engrossed in questions of ideal societal structure and the best ways for people to live together. One can imagine Plato within the walls of his celebrated academy, the school he founded amidst the tranquil olive groves outside Athens. By this time he had reached middle age, with enough experience to be confident in his philosophical concepts, yet retaining a youthful enthusiasm and openness to new discoveries. As the morning light filtered through the dense foliage, he delved into Solon's notes on Atlantis, perceiving in this ancient story a profound connection to his own philosophical inquiries. Plato was captivated by the story of Atlantis, not so much by the dramatic chronicle of its demise, but by the description of the social order that existed there before its fall. Here was a civilization that seemed to embody many of the aspects Plato considered fundamental to true human happiness: prosperity, devoid of social inequality, governance free from corruption, and an education system that developed both practical skills and deep moral wisdom. However, Plato was too astute a philosopher to merely retell Solon's narrative without subjecting it to deep contemplation. In the story of Atlantis, he saw a unique opportunity to explore questions that occupied his mind. What precisely constitutes a just society? How can political power be wielded with wisdom? And why do civilizations, having reached the peak of their greatness, sometimes find themselves on the brink of self-destruction. This is why, when Plato began to recount the story of Atlantis in his famous dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he accomplished something far more complex than simply preserving a historical account. He used this tradition as a powerful tool for profound reflection on political philosophy, on the fundamental conditions that foster the prosperity of human societies, and on the destructive forces that lead to their inevitable decline. Thus, Atlantis, as presented in Plato's works, is simultaneously a real historical civilization, information about which Solon gleaned in Egypt, and at the same time an artful philosophical experiment exploring the boundless possibilities and inherent limitations of human society. Plato presents this tradition as a story told by Critias, who, according to his assertions, heard it from his grandfather, who, in turn, heard it from Solon himself. In the tranquil silence of his academy, surrounded by numerous students who had come to Athens from all corners of the Hellenic world in search of philosophical knowledge, Plato diligently worked on his rendition of the history of Atlantis. The writing process was unhurried and exceptionally meticulous. Every sentence was carefully considered to simultaneously align with historical veracity and serve a profound philosophical purpose. However, what is remarkable is this: Plato also never completed his narrative. The dialogue Critias, intended to fully unfold the story of Atlantis, breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the narrative unfinished for the second time in its long journey from an Egyptian temple to a Greek philosophical school. As you drift to sleep this evening, dear reader, perhaps you might reflect on those unfinished manuscripts, on those incomplete stories that somehow managed to preserve enough detail to continue captivating minds for the next 2 millennia. What is it about an unfinished narrative that makes it, at times, more compelling than a fully completed one? And perhaps you will ponder that unbreakable chain of storytellers, the wise Egyptian priest, the great Solon, the profound Plato. Each brought something of their own to the story, simultaneously overlooking or altering something. Each carefully preserved the memory of the past, yet transformed it, until the history of Atlantis became a legacy belonging equally to imagination and to historical record. From Plato's unfinished manuscripts and Solon's gradually fading memories, one can attempt to reconstruct only fragmentary notions of what Atlantean structures might have looked like. These were not the grand, dramatic towers and impossible spires that artists would later invent, but something far more elegant and astonishing. Their architecture, it seems, interacted with natural forces rather than opposing them. The structures appeared to grow organically from the surrounding landscape, as naturally as trees or mountain peaks. One could imagine a person standing at the edge of what was once the greatest harbour of the ancient world, gazing upon a city that rose gently in sloping terraces from the water's edge to a central plateau where the most important temples stood. The first thing that would strike them would be the astonishing difference of this architecture from anything they had ever seen before. Atlantean structures were built predominantly from stone, yet it was not the rough, angular masonry that characterized the constructions of many other ancient civilizations. On the contrary, Atlantean architects mastered such precise cutting and skillful working of stone that their blocks joined together without any mortar, forming walls that were both incredibly strong and strikingly elegant. The stone itself possessed unique properties. It was a type of volcanic rock abundantly present on the island, exhibiting a natural hue that ranged from soft cream to rich gold, depending on the intensity of the light and time of day. When the morning sun illuminated the walls of Atlantean structures, they seemed to radiate an inner warmth, imbuing the entire city with a sense of vibrancy and welcome. However, what made Atlantean architecture truly outstanding was the masterful integration of water into all aspects of its design. This was a civilization that perceived water not merely as a utilitarian necessity, but as a profound aesthetic and spiritual element, capable of fundamentally transforming daily existence within a built environment. Walking through the residential areas, one would notice that every building, from the humblest dwelling to the grandest palace, was designed with the dynamics and acoustics of water flows in mind. Fountains did not merely serve as embellishments. They were integral components of the architectural structure, harmoniously incorporated into courtyards, vestibules, and even rooftop gardens. The engineering feats required for such deep integration were so sophisticated that similar achievements remained unattainable for many centuries. The Atlanteans developed an extensive system of underground canals and reservoirs that supplied clean water from mountain springs to every part of the city. But instead of concealing these functional conduits, they made them an integral part of the aesthetic appeal of the structures. One could imagine strolling through a typical Atlantean neighborhood, hearing the continuous melodic murmur of water flowing through channels laid along street edges, seeing fountains serving both utilitarian and aesthetic functions, observing how the architecture created a favorable microclimate, providing coolness inside structures in summer and warmth in colder seasons. The public buildings of Atlantis were even more magnificent. The Great Library, for instance, was conceived as a complex of interconnected courtyards, each featuring a unique water element. Here were smooth, reflecting pools mirroring the sky's blue with impeccable clarity, multi-tiered waterfalls emitting a calming white noise conducive to deep concentration, and delicate streams winding between reading zones, acting as natural dividers. The main temple complex stood at the highest point of the island. However, it was not a single colossal structure like the Parthenon in Athens or the pyramids in Egypt. Instead, it was an ensemble of several smaller buildings connected by covered galleries, with each building serving specific rituals and solitary contemplation. What was particularly striking about these temples was how organically they integrated into the surrounding landscape. Atlantean architects meticulously studied wind and weather patterns, the sun's trajectory throughout the day and changing seasons, and the natural drainage systems of the land. Their buildings enhanced these natural mechanisms rather than confronting them. The largest temple was dedicated not to a specific deity, but to the boundless ocean itself, the powerful element that embraced their island, granted them prosperity through commerce, stabilized their weather patterns, and provided sustenance. This temple was built partially below ground, with chambers extending deep beneath sea level, allowing visitors to experience the acoustics and dynamics of water from both below and above the surface. The acoustic properties of Atlantean architecture were exceptionally sophisticated. Builders deeply understood how the configuration and materials of spaces could both amplify and dampen sound waves. They understood how the placement of openings could provide natural ventilation that also served musical functions. Many buildings integrated wind chimes and water features that created exquisite, continuously evolving soundscapes. The construction methods employed in Atlantis were so advanced that they would remain utterly incomprehensible to subsequent civilizations. Builders mastered ways of moving and assembling colossal stone blocks with a precision comparable to modern construction equipment. However, they achieved this through ingenious engineering, not brute physical force. Cleverly designed systems of levers, counterweights and inclined planes allowed comparatively small teams of workers to accomplish truly monumental feats. More importantly, Atlantean construction was geared towards exceptional durability. Builders were aware of their island's geological activity, its susceptibility to seismic events and slow topographical changes. Their architecture was imbued with principles of flexibility, joints capable of absorbing shifts, foundations that allowed for slow subsidence without compromising structural integrity, and materials that aged gracefully over time. Ornamental elements of Atlantean buildings were carved directly into the stone, rather than being applied decorations. These carved images typically featured natural motifs, depictions of waves, marine life, and patterns inspired by seashells and coral reefs. However, the decor was always subordinate to function, emphasizing the building's purpose rather than distracting from its essence. Private homes in Atlantis followed similar principles but on a smaller scale. Even the most modest dwellings featured courtyards adorned with fountains, rooftop gardens that provided both sustenance and aesthetic pleasure, and rooms designed to account for prevailing winds and optimal natural light. Particularly noteworthy was how Atlantean architecture approached the interpenetration of interior and exterior space. Many buildings featured walls that could fully open in good weather, creating spaces that were simultaneously indoors and outdoors. Rooms flowed seamlessly into gardens. Gardens harmoniously dissolved into natural landscapes, and the boundaries between the artificial and natural environments became blurred and permeable. Workshops and industrial zones in Atlantis were planned with the same meticulous care as temples and residential homes. Pottery workshops were situated to maximize morning light. Metalworking shops were equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems that removed smoke and excess heat from work areas, maintaining optimal temperatures for the operations performed. Even the port facilities bore witness to the Atlanteans' genius in harmoniously combining utilitarian function with aesthetic perfection. The docks were built from the same golden stone as the rest of the city's structures, with integrated systems for loading and unloading goods, making the process both efficient and visually appealing. Warehouses were designed with ample window openings, providing abundant natural light while protecting goods from scorching sun and precipitation. As the years passed and the island gradually succumbed to the sea, Atlantean architecture revealed yet another facet of its sophistication. Buildings did not simply decay as water levels rose. They demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Lower levels were abandoned and sealed, while upper levels continued to be used. Roofs transformed into new ground levels. The city, quite literally, learned to live with constant change, maintaining its key functions even as its physical form underwent metamorphosis. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, one could imagine these buildings in their submerged state, not ruined or broken, but somehow still retaining their grandeur, still preserving their fundamental proportions and spatial relationships. Fish now glide through courtyards where fountains once splashed. Marine plants sprout in window boxes that once held herbs and flowers. And perhaps a reflection might arise about the secrets of construction and design, swallowed by the ocean depths along with these structures. What wisdom about existing in unison with natural elements was irrevocably lost when the last Atlantean architect set sail for an unknown future, holding in memory the principles of an architectural tradition that was never to be fully revived. Those last ships that sailed from the sinking spires of Atlantis carried something far more significant than just refugees. They carried the seeds of new civilizations, fragments of memories of a highly advanced society, and a desperate hope that somewhere beyond the vast ocean they would find a land where they could rebuild their lives. But what was the fate of these survivors? And where, ultimately, did their wanderings lead them? One could imagine oneself aboard one of these evacuation vessels, crowded with families who had taken only what they could carry, heading towards a horizon that promised no clear destination. The ship was sturdily built, designed by Atlantean craftsmen who foresaw that their people might have to leave their homeland for a long time. However, it was loaded far beyond its standard capacity. People slept directly on deck, and provisions were carefully rationed to last for an unknown voyage. The captain, a seasoned mariner who had plied trade routes to distant ports for decades, felt uncertain about this voyage. Familiar trade routes led to lands that might not be able to accommodate such a significant number of refugees. Uncharted territories offered prospects for new settlements, but also held unknown dangers and trials. Among the passengers, one could observe the entire social spectrum of Atlantean society, concentrated in the confined space of a single vessel. Here were philosophers and farmers, skilled artisans and visionary merchants, elderly people who remembered the golden days of Atlantean prosperity, and children born into a world already entering a phase of change. What is striking about these migrants is their remarkable capacity for self-organization during a long and arduous journey. Despite limited circumstances and uncertain prospects, they carefully preserved the social structures and educational practices that made their civilization unique. Children consistently acquire knowledge in mathematics, natural sciences, and various practical skills. Adults establish special committees to plan for various possible future scenarios. Some ships steered north, towards the shores of what would later become the European continent. These vessels followed long-established maritime trade routes, seeking refuge in ports where Atlantean merchants were welcomed with open arms and well known. The survivors who chose this direction often had the strongest business relationships. These were people who believed they could revive their prosperity within existing trade networks. One can imagine one such northern expedition making landfall on a coast where Bronze Age communities nestled in river estuaries and sheltered coves. The local inhabitants initially greeted these strangers, arriving in expertly built ships with exotic items, with suspicion, but gradually connections were forged between them. The Atlanteans shared their advanced knowledge and valuable skills in exchange for a plot of land and recognition of their presence. In these new communities, Atlantean culture began to intertwine with local traditions. The migrants introduced new metalworking techniques, improved agricultural technologies, and innovative architectural solutions, which local builders adapted to available materials and environmental conditions. However, they also absorbed local customs, learned unfamiliar languages, and gradually integrated into existing social orders. Other ships set a course west, into waters that few Atlantean seafarers had ever explored in detail. These expeditions were characterized by greater boldness and a spirit of adventure, comprised of people who chose the unpredictability of unknown territories over the difficulties of assimilation into already formed communities. Their voyages were longer and riskier, but they offered the opportunity to establish truly new colonies where Atlantean culture could be preserved in its pristine integrity. The Western expeditions faced difficulties that severely tested all aspects of their seafaring prowess. Storms blew ships off course, supplies dwindled before land was sighted. Navigation became an art of deciphering subtle clues in atmospheric phenomena, ocean currents, and the behavior of marine life. When these Western travelers eventually reached land, presumably on the coasts of the African continent or other, even more distant lands, they found an environment fundamentally different from their lost island homeland. Impenetrable thickets instead of familiar cultivated terraces, river flows carving paths through unfamiliar channels, climates that dictated the need for new methods in agriculture, construction, and daily life. One can imagine the stages of forming these new settlements: careful selection of sites providing access to fresh water, advantageous defensive positions, and proximity to natural resources. The primary priority was always to ensure shelter and food security, but even in these extreme circumstances, Atlantean settlers sought to integrate characteristic features of their distinctive architecture and urban planning principles. The early years of these settlements were characterized by continuous adaptation and bold experimentation. Agricultural crops that thrived in Atlantis did not always take root in other soils and climates. Construction methods required significant modification to work with available materials. Social structures evolved to effectively respond to emerging difficulties, while carefully preserving fundamental cultural principles. Some migrant communities prospered in their new conditions, transforming step by step from temporary encampments into settled communities, and then into cities that could rival their lost homeland in terms of prosperity and sophistication. These successful settlements became centers of enlightenment and cultural development, preserving Atlantean knowledge while creating new, original innovations drawn from their new surrounding environment. Other settlements experienced significant difficulties in their new conditions. Unfavorable climatic conditions, hostile neighbors, or the deep psychological trauma caused by the loss of their homeland prevented some migrant communities from establishing a sustainable new existence. These settlements existed for 1 or 2 generations before falling into disuse or being assimilated by larger local populations. The fate of Atlantean culture in these numerous disparate communities is one of the most fascinating facets of the survivors' history. In some places, the migrants deliberately tried to preserve their traditions in their pristine form, creating communities that acted like living repositories of their lost civilization. Children learned Atlantean songs and legends. Artisans consistently crafted items in traditional styles, and scholars worked to conserve the written records of their culture. In other communities, the process of merging with the local population progressed more rapidly. Atlantean migrants intermarried with members of existing families, adopted local customs, and gradually observed their unique culture dissolving into broader regional customs. Within a few generations, only certain skills, legends, or artistic motifs served as echoes of their Atlantean heritage. The most successful migrant settlements were those that managed to find a balance between careful preservation and flexible adaptation. These communities retained their fundamental cultural values and key knowledge, while embracing innovations that contributed to their prosperity in new conditions. Archaeological evidence of these Atlantean settlements remains inherently complex to unambiguously identify. How does one differentiate the natural cultural development of local peoples from the introduced influence of migrants from a lost civilization? However, a number of researchers believe they can detect Atlantean influence in the sudden emergence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated agricultural technologies, or distinctive artistic trends in various parts of the ancient world. Perhaps even more significantly, Atlantean migrants contributed to the development of maritime civilizations, both in the Mediterranean and beyond. Their highly advanced navigation skills, progressive shipbuilding technologies, and deep understanding of ocean currents could have significantly impacted the expansion of trade routes and the intensification of cultural interaction. As these disparate communities evolved over many generations, they maintained contact with each other whenever possible. Ships transported not only commercial goods, but also news and cultural innovations between distant communities. Thus, an entire network of communities bearing the imprint of Atlantean influence could have formed, united by a common origin and continuous cultural exchange. In the evening hour, as it's time to go to sleep, one can reflect on the distant descendants of those first migrants. Did their communities survive long enough to influence subsequent civilizations? Did echoes of Atlantean knowledge remain in the customs of peoples who never knew the name of the lost island? And perhaps one can imagine those first nights in new lands, when exhausted migrants set up temporary camps on foreign shores, gazing at the same celestial bodies their ancestors had seen from Atlantis, wondering if they would have the strength and wisdom to create something commensurate with what they had lost. The Greeks, who first heard Plato's account of Atlantis, were by no means unfamiliar with natural catastrophes. They inhabited a landscape whose contours were shaped by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, where the solid earth beneath their feet could suddenly shift, and mountain ranges could give birth to new islands in spectacular bursts of fire and ash. Understanding the story of Atlantis is inextricably linked to comprehending how the ancient Greeks perceived and remembered these powerful natural forces. Imagine yourself in ancient Greece during one of the regular earthquakes that shook the region. You are in a modest coastal settlement, perhaps on one of the islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. Morning dawned as usual. Fishermen untangle their nets. Merchants set up their stalls in the market square. Children play in the dusty streets among tightly clustered dwellings. Then the earth begins to move. At first it's just a faint tremor, so slight it makes you doubt its reality. A cup begins to jingle on the tabletop. A bird takes flight from its perch. Then the tremors become undeniable. A swaying, rocking sensation that makes it difficult to maintain balance, as if the solid ground has suddenly turned into a fluid mass beneath your feet. The earthquake lasts only a few moments, but those moments feel like hours. Buildings sway ominously and creak. People rush out of their homes, stumbling, looking around in confusion and terror. Animals exhibit unusual behavior. Dogs bark incessantly, horses stampede in panic. Even the smallest insects seem to sense something amiss in the world. When the earth finally ceases its tremors, urgent recovery efforts begin. Dwellings had to be carefully inspected for damage. Cracks in walls needed to be repaired before the winter rains came. Water sources might be contaminated, affecting taste or making access difficult. The harbour area might have shifted, requiring dredging or the construction of new docks. For the Greeks, earthquakes were not perceived as random phenomena, but as clear manifestations of divine power. Poseidon, the mighty lord of the seas, was also revered as the earth-shaker, a deity who controlled the trembling of the earth and the destructive tsunamis that sometimes followed powerful quakes. Understanding such catastrophes implied comprehending the interconnectedness between gods and mortals, and how human actions could influence cosmic forces. The Greeks, being a pragmatic people, paid close attention to natural patterns and precursors of natural disasters. They observed that certain meteorological phenomena often preceded earthquakes. Their observations extended to animal behavior, as well as changes in underground springs, which could indicate impending cataclysms. In response to these challenges, the ancient Greeks developed construction technologies designed to ensure the survival of buildings during moderate tremors. Volcanic eruptions, of course, made an even stronger and more lasting impression than earthquakes. Living in a region with relatively high volcanic activity, the Greeks witnessed both spectacular and terrifying processes in which subterranean fires could reshape the landscape literally overnight. Imagine finding ourselves on the island of Thera during one such volcanic episode, though not the grand eruption that ultimately destroyed the Minoan settlement. We observe from a safe distance as the mountain in the center of the island begins to spew steam and ash, forming a colossal column of smoke and debris that rises high into the sky and is clearly visible from neighboring islands. The eruption begins gradually, accompanied by small earthquakes and the release of gases smelling of sulfur and hot stone. Locals, experienced in living with volcanic activity, begin to prepare. They secure loose objects, cover wells and food supplies to protect them from ash. Everyone decides whether to stay and weather the eruption or evacuate to safer areas. As the eruption intensifies, rivers of molten rock become visible, slowly but inexorably flowing down the mountain slopes towards the sea. When the lava reaches the water, it creates huge clouds of steam and new land as the molten rock cools and solidifies. The sound accompanying this phenomenon is truly indescribable, a combination of hissing, rumbling, and cracking audible for miles around. The consequences of such eruptions could be both devastating and beneficial. Ash, of course, could bury crops and damage structures, but volcanic soil, in turn, was incredibly fertile. New land formed from lava flows could provide space for expanding settlements. Hot springs generated by volcanic activity provided warmth for buildings and offered therapeutic health benefits. The Greeks developed a complex understanding of the relationship between destruction and renewal in the context of natural catastrophes. They observed that forests ravaged by volcanic fires often grew back more luxuriantly than before. They noted that earthquakes, while destroying old structures, opened opportunities for erecting more advanced ones. They realized that the same forces that could bring disaster could also bring prosperity. This profound understanding influenced how they interpreted stories like the tale of Atlantis. When Plato described a civilization destroyed by earthquakes and floods, his Greek audience immediately perceived this as a perfectly plausible, even inevitable part of the natural order. They had seen firsthand how quickly prosperity could turn to catastrophe, how the very geographical features that made a place desirable could also make it vulnerable. The Greeks also understood the psychological impact of natural disasters. They had experienced firsthand how earthquakes and eruptions could alter people's relationship with their environment, forcing them to realize the temporary nature of all human achievements. They saw how survivors often developed different priorities, focusing more on community bonds and less on material accumulation. Greek historians and philosophers paid particular attention to how natural disasters influenced the rise and fall of civilizations. They observed that societies that became too complacent, too confident in their mastery over nature, often suffered the most severely when disaster struck. Civilizations that maintained an awareness of their vulnerability, that built flexibility into their social and physical structures, were more likely to survive and rebuild. This historical perspective would have influenced how Plato's contemporaries understood the story of Atlantis. They would have seen it not as an impossible fantasy, but as a perfectly plausible account of how even the most advanced civilization could be brought low by forces beyond human control. The Greek experience with natural disasters also influenced their approach to urban planning and architecture. They preferred to build on higher ground, less susceptible to floods. They constructed buildings with relatively simple, sturdy designs capable of withstanding moderate earthquakes. They developed water storage systems that would continue to function even if primary sources were disrupted. Religious practices in Greece reflected this constant awareness of natural forces. Temples often included sanctuaries to gods associated with earthquakes, volcanic activity, and storms. Religious festivals incorporated ceremonies designed to maintain good relations with these powerful deities. Prayers and sacrifices were seen as practical measures to prepare for disasters, as important as storing food or maintaining robust buildings. The cultural memory of major catastrophes was preserved through stories, songs, and religious rites that maintained awareness across generations. Grandparents told grandchildren about the powerful earthquakes they had experienced. Poets incorporated tales of natural disasters into epic narratives. Religious leaders reminded communities of the importance of maintaining respect for natural forces. This cultural foundation for understanding catastrophes helps explain why the story of Atlantis resonated so strongly with a Greek audience. It was not merely a fascinating tale of a lost civilization. It was a reflection on themes that were central to the Greek experience and Greek wisdom about how to live in a world where the earth beneath your feet could shift without warning. As you drift to sleep tonight, perhaps we might reflect on how these ancient experiences of natural catastrophes relate to modern ones. Do we understand, as the Greeks did, that our technological advancements do not exempt us from natural forces? Do our cities and societies build in the flexibility that can help communities survive and recover from unexpected challenges? And perhaps we will dream of those Greek storytellers sitting by fires on earthquake-shaken islands, weaving tales that help their communities understand both the power of nature and the resilience of human culture, passing down wisdom about how to live with dignity in a world that can change without warning. Long before Plato crafted his philosophical dialogues about Atlantis, and many centuries before Solon journeyed to Egypt to hear ancient stories from temple priests, the Greeks had already developed their own sophisticated traditions of preserving and transmitting cultural memory. Understanding how these oral storytelling traditions functioned helps us appreciate both the power and the complexity of the Atlantis narrative as it has reached us through the ages. Imagine a scene, a large hall on a Greek island, perhaps during the time when Homer composed his great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, centuries before Plato's birth. The evening meal has concluded, and the household has gathered around a central hearth where a fire burns steadily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. An elderly storyteller, a professional bard whose very existence depended on his ability to remember and perform lengthy narrative poems, prepares to begin the evening's performance. This storyteller holds in his memory not just one or two stories, but dozens of interconnected narratives that collectively preserve the history, values, and cultural identity of his people. He knows genealogies tracing family lines back 20 generations. He can recount detailed accounts of wars fought centuries ago, naming heroes, describing their weapons and armor, and outlining the political relationships that led to conflict. However, the storyteller does not merely recite a memorized text, like a modern actor performing from a script. Instead, he recreates these stories each time, using traditional formulas, conventional descriptions, and standard narrative patterns to craft performances that feel both ancient and immediate, familiar and fresh. The audience actively participates in this creative process, responding to the storyteller's performance in a way that influences the development of the plot. If the listeners show particular interest in a minor character, the bard might elaborate on their story, delving into details. If a part of the narrative seems to drag, he is free to shorten it or move on to more exciting episodes. Stories evolve through this dynamic interaction between the storyteller and his audience, adapting to changing tastes and interests while preserving their core meaning. This oral storytelling tradition developed complex and effective methods for preserving historical information across many generations. Bards used rhythmic poetic forms that significantly facilitated the memorization of extensive stories. They employed recurring formulas, standard ways of describing common actions, characters or objects, which served as powerful mnemonic devices and created a distinctive, recognizable style that the audience expected and appreciated. Perhaps the most significant aspect was that these masters of words skillfully integrated invaluable cultural information into engaging narratives that people were genuinely interested in. Facts from the past, knowledge about the world, ethical principles, and valuable practical skills, all these elements were harmoniously intertwined in plots rich with adventure, romance, and epic confrontations. Such an approach not only kept listeners captivated but also deeply immersed them in the study of their own cultural heritage. It is easy to imagine how a narrative like the tragic fall of Atlantis could have been preserved and transmitted from generation to generation precisely through such oral traditions. Its vivid, dramatic components, the story of a prosperous civilization, its moral decay and its subsequent horrifying destruction, undoubtedly made it a spectacular performance. At the same time, this story carried profound lessons about the complex dynamics between human communities and the power of nature, about the fatal consequences of hubris, and about the immutable necessity of honoring higher, divine forces. With each new performance, the story inevitably acquired its unique features, subtly adapting to the specific audience and the pressing issues of the current moment. For example, a storyteller performing before an assembly of merchants might emphasize the economic achievements of Atlantean civilization. A singer entertaining soldiers would likely delve into descriptions of its military prowess and tactical maneuvers, and a performer at a sacred festival might comprehensively explore the moral and spiritual aspects of the ancient tale. Over centuries, the original narrative could give rise to numerous variations, each carefully preserving certain facets of the initial story, while simultaneously mirroring the interests and values of the communities that sustained their existence. Some of these versions might have remained as close as possible to historical realities, while others underwent transformation into something more mythological, incorporating fantastic supernatural elements. This made the stories more captivating and entertaining, but at the same time reduced their literal accuracy. Thus, the ancient Greek tradition of preserving and transmitting tales through oral performance created a kind of living, dynamic treasury of knowledge that surpassed any collection of written texts in its incredible flexibility and adaptability. These masters of words did not simply mechanically reproduce memorized stories. They acted as living embodiments of collective cultural memory, carrying within them the quintessence of wisdom and the invaluable experience of many generations. One could imagine a listener attending to one such skilled storyteller, who masterfully weaves together various narrative threads, cleverly linking the story of Atlantis with other tales of vanished civilizations and divine retribution. The narrator might begin with a well-known account of a mighty island kingdom, then smoothly transition to related plots, the myth of Deucalion's flood, the tragic fall of Troy, or the odyssey of Odysseus through exotic and wondrous lands, many of which, perhaps, had long since disappeared from the face of the earth. This narrative tradition acquires particular significance for understanding the phenomenon of Atlantis due to its approach to the relationship between historical accuracy and artistic truth. Ancient bards deeply understood that sometimes the most essential truths about human existence could only be conveyed to the listener through tales that, while perhaps not literally factual, possessed undeniable emotional and spiritual accuracy. In such a context, it's easy to see how a story like Atlantis could function. Regardless of whether this island kingdom existed exactly as Plato described it, the narrative itself carried fundamental truths about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the complex dialectic between human aspirations and the elemental forces of nature, and about how abundance and power can corrupt even the most advanced and enlightened societies. The storytellers who carefully preserved these ancient traditions were not historians in the modern sense of the word, for whom precise facts and documentary evidence are of paramount importance. On the contrary, they acted as cultural thinkers, using the power of narrative to deeply explore fundamental questions of human nature and social organization. Their stories served a dual purpose, to both instruct and entertain, while preserving both wisdom and valuable information. Within this tradition, the minute details of the narrative could vary from one performance to another, yet the profound essence and core message remained immutable. For example, a storyteller might describe Atlantean ships, endowing them with different types of sails, depending on whether he was performing before an assembly of merchants or farmers. He might also highlight different aspects of Atlantean society, based on the current political interests of his listeners. Nevertheless, the key idea of the transience of even the grandest human achievements was always preserved. It was this plasticity that allowed tales to retain their significance and relevance across many generations, and in the most diverse social contexts. A narrative that might initially have been a historical chronicle of a Bronze Age maritime civilization could later transform into a profound philosophical reflection, perfectly suited to the intellectual atmosphere of classical Athens. Then it could transform again, becoming a didactic moral lesson, relevant to later audiences with different concerns and values. The physical setting in which these oral performances unfolded also played a significant role. Most often they took place in private domestic settings or in public spaces. Spacious halls, cosy courtyards, bustling festive squares where listeners felt at ease and comfortable. The storyteller skillfully created an intimate, trusting atmosphere that fully disposed the audience to emotional immersion in the story, prompting them to recognize themselves in the described heroes and situations. One can easily imagine a listener in such a setting as the storyteller reaches the climax of the Atlantis story, the moment of the grand earthquake and the all-consuming flood that destroyed the island kingdom. His voice might drop to a barely audible whisper as he vividly portrays the last fateful moments, how the sea waters relentlessly rose, engulfing beautiful terraces and gardens, how the last ships hastily departed from the sinking towers. The audience, mesmerized by the drama, would instinctively lean forward, completely absorbed in the unfolding events. It is remarkable that even with repeated listenings to such stories, these oral performances paid no less attention to the consequences of the catastrophe. The storyteller meticulously described the fate of the Atlantean survivors, their desperate search for a new home, their persistent attempts to preserve their cultural customs in a foreign land. Such episodes created a deep connection between the ancient tale and the personal experiences of the listeners, many of whom might themselves have been descendants of migrants and refugees, who had endured earlier conflicts and natural disasters. Moreover, the narrative tradition surprisingly preserved and transmitted technical and purely practical knowledge, embedding it in the form of engaging entertainment. For example, descriptions of Atlantean ships might include highly accurate information about naval architecture and navigation principles. Tales of Atlantean agriculture could contain valuable data on irrigation systems and crop rotation rules. Thus, these stories served as informal educational tools, which not only transmitted practical skills, but also conveyed cultural values. However, perhaps the most significant contribution of the oral tradition was the creation of a deep sense of continuity between the past and the present, between the legendary world of heroes and deities and the everyday reality of the listeners. When the storyteller vividly depicted the bustling markets of Atlantis, the audience could easily draw parallels with their own experiences of commerce and trade relations. When he recounted Atlantean families facing the loss of their homeland, listeners involuntarily related this to their personal understanding of forced displacement and the need to adapt to new conditions. It was this powerful emotional connection that ensured the tales such deep and lasting memorability, something that dry, purely factual reports often failed to achieve. People preserved these traditions in their memory, not only because of their entertainment value, but also because they were perceived as personally significant, helping listeners to make sense of their own lives and the challenges facing them in a much broader, universal perspective. The ancient Greek tradition of storytelling also vividly demonstrated the collective nature of cultural memory. Tales were not the property of individual authors. They belonged to entire communities that carefully preserved and transmitted them. Each new performance was a communal act, in which the active participation of the audience contributed to the formation and further development of the narrative. Thus, stories evolved through this collective process, adapting to constantly changing conditions, but always retaining their unchanging, profound essence. When written literature gradually began to complement and then displace oral tradition, this led to both certain losses and significant gain. Written texts undoubtedly allowed for the recording of details with much greater meticulousness and precision, but they lacked the vividness, flexibility, and immediacy that characterized live performance. They could reach a much wider audience spreading over significant distances, but were deprived of the ability to adapt as sensitively and quickly to the local interests and needs of listeners. This transition from oral to written culture also fundamentally changed people's perception of stories themselves. Written sources stimulated a more analytical and critical view of narrative, whereas live oral performance fully promoted deep emotional immersion and personal identification with characters and themes. Both approaches undoubtedly possess their unique value, but each forms completely different types of relationships between stories and their audiences. Understanding this ancient tradition of storytelling helps shed light on why the tale of Atlantis retains its striking persuasiveness over millennia. This story functions simultaneously on several levels. It appears as a historical chronicle, a profound philosophical reflection, a didactic moral lesson, and a captivating entertainment. It possesses the ability to adapt to the most diverse cultural contexts, while invariably preserving its fundamental power, prompting people to reflect on the complex interrelationship between human achievements and the powerful forces of nature. Reflecting before sleep, one might ponder how stories continue to shape our perception of the world. Even in this age of ubiquitous digital communications and dominant scientific analysis, humanity still resorts to narrative as a tool for making sense of complex experiences, for preserving enduring cultural values, and for exploring those profound questions for which no definitive factual answers exist. One might indulge in thoughts of ancient storytellers, whose voices, transcending millennia, bring us the wisdom and wondrous tales of civilizations that existed long before our era. These stories serve as an unfailing reminder that some truths are too significant to be entrusted solely to historians. There is knowledge that can only be preserved through that sacred art of storytelling, which helps us grasp not only the events that transpired, but also their deep, multifaceted meaning. In this final mental journey through the mysterious world of Atlantis, the observer finds themselves not amidst the sands of ancient Egypt or the majestic columns of classical Athens, but here, in our modern world. They are surrounded by the soft, hypnotic glow of electronic devices and the gentle, rhythmic whisper of modern technology. Nevertheless, the narrative of the great island kingdom continues to speak to humanity across millennia, offering insights and warnings that seem as pertinent today as they did to Plato's original audience. Imagine a person walking slowly through a modern city at dusk, watching the lights come on in countless windows and seeing the endless stream of traffic flowing through the streets. These streets connect districts and neighborhoods in patterns that would have seemed magical and incomprehensible to ancient observers. The modern world has revealed technological wonders capable of astonishing even the Atlanteans. Instant communication spanning vast distances, vehicles moving faster than any ancient ship, and architectural behemoths towering above their greatest temples. However, carefully observing this modern landscape, one might notice how many of the challenges Atlantis presumably faced remain relevant today. These are questions of how to balance prosperity with sustainability, how to maintain social cohesion in the face of rapid change, and how to preserve cultural values while adapting to new technologies and global connections. The story of Atlantis resonates with the modern world partly because it touches upon enduring themes of the rise and fall of civilizations. Every advanced society faces the challenge of managing its own success, preventing abundance from breeding complacency, and maintaining the fundamental values and practices that initially fostered its flourishing. These patterns are easily traceable in the historical experience of humanity. Civilizations that become overly confident in their mastery over natural forces, too convinced of their technological superiority, and excessively dismissive of wisdom preserved in traditional practices, often find themselves unprepared for the challenges that can undermine even the most developed societies. The environmental themes in the Atlantis narrative appear particularly relevant for the current moment. Plato's description tells of a civilization that achieved phenomenal prosperity through its mastery over natural resources and its masterful understanding of engineering and agriculture. However, this very mastery may have fostered an excessive self-confidence among the Atlanteans in their ability to control natural forces, which ultimately proved beyond human management. Modern humanity faces comparable dilemmas regarding the interplay between technological progress and ecological sustainability. Unprecedented ability has been achieved to extract resources from the earth, transform natural systems, and sustain large urban populations in conditions that might naturally support much smaller communities. But these achievements simultaneously create new vulnerabilities that we are only beginning to comprehend. The story of Atlantis serves as a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations remain dependent on natural systems that operate according to their own internal logic, not in accordance with human preferences or plans. Global climate shifts, tectonic movements, volcanic cataclysms, and other natural phenomena continue to shape human history in ways that our highest technological sophistication cannot fully control or predict with absolute accuracy. However, the narrative of Atlantis goes beyond a mere warning about environmental catastrophe. It also offers profound insights into social and political problems that remain relevant for modern democracies and international relations. Plato's description paints a picture of a society that gradually deviated from its original course, despite achieving impressive material and cultural successes. Tradition holds that early Atlantean society was characterized by justice, wisdom, and mutually beneficial cooperation, both within the island kingdom and with other civilizations. But over time, abundance and power began to corrupt these original values. The Atlanteans became more aggressive towards their neighbors, more focused on material acquisition than on cultural and spiritual development, and asserted their superiority, showing less respect for other peoples and their traditions. Such patterns are easily discernible in the annals of modern nations and empires. Societies that reach the pinnacle of power and prosperity often struggle to maintain the values and practices that ensured their initial success. Wealth and technological advancements can create an illusion of invulnerability, leading to erroneous decisions and, ultimately, to inevitable decline. The international dimensions of the Atlantean story also resonate in our modern world. Plato depicts Atlantis as a powerful maritime trading empire with extensive connections throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Its strength was partly rooted in its ability to foster peaceful exchange between diverse cultures, serving as a prosperous bridge between distant peoples with different languages, customs, and resources. The modern global economy relies on similar networks of international trade and communication. Like ancient Atlantis, humanity's well-being rests on complex, multi-layered mechanisms of exchange that connect communities across vast distances. However, these same intricacies create interdependencies that can make entire regions vulnerable to upheavals arising in distant parts of the globe. The sudden collapse of Atlantean civilization serves as a stark warning of how swiftly complex systems can unravel when key components fail. Modern logistics chains, global communication networks, and financial institutions have created unprecedented abundance and comfort, but they also create qualitatively new types of vulnerabilities that we are still learning to understand and manage effectively. Perhaps one of the most significant lessons conveyed by the story of Atlantis is the reminder of the invaluable importance of cultural memory and the preservation of wisdom. Those who survived the great catastrophe managed to rebuild their lives in new places partly because they carried with them the knowledge and values of their lost civilization. They preserved not only practical skills but also profound philosophical insights into how to organize societies and maintain harmonious relationships between different communities. Modern humanity produces colossal amounts of information. However, it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish mere information from genuine wisdom. The rapid pace of technological progress often prompts us to dismiss traditional knowledge as archaic, even when that knowledge contains enduring insights into human nature and social organization that remain relevant regardless of technological development. The way the Atlantis narrative was preserved and transmitted for thousands of years also offers lessons about the continuity of cultural heritage. The legend survived not through meticulous archiving in libraries, but because it consistently resonated with the concerns and interests of subsequent generations. Each retelling adapted the story to contemporary circumstances, while preserving its unchanging fundamental ideas. This dynamic process of adaptive preservation could serve as a model for how to maintain cultural continuity in our rapidly changing world, rather than adhering to rigid preservation of old forms and practices. The focus should be on recognizing the core values and insights contained within traditional wisdom and finding new forms to embody and implement these principles. The narrative of Atlantis also highlights the undeniable importance of humility in the face of forces beyond human control. Regardless of the level of technological sophistication achieved, humanity remains dependent on natural systems that operate according to their own logic. And regardless of the power of civilizations, they are inevitably subject to changes and challenges that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Such an awareness should not lead to pessimistic or fatalistic sentiments. On the contrary, it can stimulate a more thoughtful approach to development and progress, an approach that considers the long-term viability of achievements and the necessity of maintaining adaptability and resilience in the face of uncertainty. The story of Atlantis has served as an inexhaustible source of inspiration for countless works of literature, art, and popular culture because it deeply reflects something fundamental in the human experience of living in advanced civilizations. Humanity feels both pride in its achievements and anxiety about their longevity. It is confident in its own capabilities and aware of its limitations, grateful for achieved prosperity, and apprehensive about its sustainability. The contradictions that sometimes arise should be viewed not as insurmountable obstacles requiring immediate resolution, but rather as inherent facets of human existence that must be managed with profound wisdom. The legend of Atlantis, in turn, suggests that the true art of managing these challenges lies not in striving for absolute dominion over external circumstances, but in an unwavering adherence to those fundamental values and time-tested practices that allow a civilization to gracefully adapt to constantly transforming conditions of existence. Reflecting before sleep, one might delve into thoughts about which aspects of the current civilization they would wish to preserve most of all, if humanity, like the ancient Atlanteans, had to rebuild its societal structure in completely different conditions. The question arises, what specific knowledge, what moral foundations, and what useful skills possess such enduring significance that they should be invariably passed on to future generations, regardless of any cataclysms and changes that the relentless future may bring. And perhaps, in one's dreams, one will embark on this extended journey, which was made through the legendary lost world of Atlantis. This path stretched from a detailed study of its inhabitants' daily life to a contemplation of the grand catastrophe that marked the twilight of their prosperous civilization. It leads further to the Egyptian priests who carefully preserved fragments of their memory, and then to the Greek storytellers who tirelessly maintained and transmitted their profound wisdom to future ages. In such a dream, a striking truth might be revealed to the individual. Atlantis's true legacy was never the gleam of gold or the sparkle of jewels that once adorned its majestic structures. Its true value lay in the enduring human knowledge and accumulated wisdom that managed to survive total destruction and continue to deepen humanity's understanding of what it means to build and sustain civilizations that truly meet its highest aspirations. The tale of Atlantis continues to live through the ages, for it unfailingly serves as a powerful reminder to humanity that all people, each in their own way, are inhabitants of highly vulnerable civilizations. These civilizations, like islands of great human achievements, rise amidst boundless oceans of unexplored mysteries and ceaseless change. The questions of how humanity navigates these turbulent waters, how it safeguards what is most precious, and how it adapts to conditions beyond its direct control, continue to pose fundamental challenges to all human civilization. These challenges remain as relevant and significant today as they were in Plato's Athens, and, undoubtedly, were so in the magnificent, now legendary halls of Atlantis itself. With wishes for a good night to all who shared this journey, may their dreams become reliable guides through the darkness of night, confidently leading to any uncharted shores that await each one with the arrival of dawn.